I'm writing this letter to you, Vivian, because I want you to read it after everything is done, not to explain myself. You don't deserve an explanation. I want you to have a record, something you can hold and know that I knew. Every step, every receipt, every Tuesday night, every lie you told with my daughter asleep 20 feet away. I want you to know that the night you called me at 2 a.m. and said, "Honey, I'm working late." Then a male voice whispered in the background, "No way he believes that." I said, "He's right, I don't." Then I blocked your number, and I sat down in our kitchen, bare feet on cold tile, no lights, and I started building. That's where this begins. Not with love, not with what we were, with what you made me. The tile was cold enough to sting. I remember that specifically. The specific quality of cold linoleum at 2 a.m. when you've just heard something that rearranges every memory you have. I didn't turn on a light. I sat in the dark, and I counted the cracks in the ceiling the way you count things when your mind is trying to find a surface to grip. 14 cracks. I'd never counted them before. I mapped the last 3 years in the dark, the conference calls that ran until 10, the weekend client retreats that required a packed bag but no itinerary. The way you stopped asking about my cases around April of last year, not gradually, but one day, just stopped, like a subscription you'd canceled. I'd noticed, I'd filed it somewhere and not opened the file. Grief showed up, checked the room, found no vacancy. What moved in instead was something I recognized from work. The lawyer's reflex. The part of my brain that doesn't feel, it inventories, it catalogs, it asks, what do I have? What do I need? What is the sequence of steps that gets me from here to a position I can defend? I picked up the yellow legal pad from the kitchen counter. I keep one there for case notes, always have, and I wrote one word at the top, Preston. Then, Calder Vance, exposure. I didn't know yet what exposure meant. I just knew there was a shape to this and I was going to find its edges. Your headlights swept the driveway 20 minutes later. I heard you cut the engine, heard the specific way you close a car door when you're composing yourself, that controlled click instead of a slam. You came in rehearsing outrage. I could hear it before you opened the door, the breath intake, the volume already dialed up, the bag hitting the counter with theatrical force. I was at the table with the legal pad. I didn't look up. You blocked me. You actually blocked me. The call dropped. Go to bed, Viv. Declan, I don't know what you think you heard, but I was working and you have no right to go to bed. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment. I kept my eyes on the pad. She needed me to engage, needed volume to bounce off something, needed me to yell back so she could redirect it, turn it into a fight about my jealousy, my paranoia, my inability to trust her demanding career. I gave her nothing to push against, just the scratch of pen on paper. She slammed the bedroom door hard enough to rattle the frames in the hallway. I wrote, Morals Clause, SEC Filings, Celeste. I didn't know who Celeste was yet. I'd written the name on instinct, because men like the man I'd heard in the background always have a wife, and wives are frequently the most efficient mechanism of consequence I know. Before dawn, I had my laptop open. Calder Vance Capital's SEC filings are public record. Routine 10K. Nothing that would catch a casual reader's eye. But two subsidiary disclosures had irregular timing. A 6-week gap between material event and filing that a compliance attorney would recognize as a yellow flag. I wasn't a securities lawyer, but I knew enough to know that someone who was would find it interesting. I screenshotted both pages, dated the files, named the folder Calder Research. I didn't know what they meant yet. That was fine. Evidence doesn't have to be loaded to be useful. You just have to have it before the other person knows you're looking. Here's the thing about being a lawyer that people misunderstand. They think it's about knowing the law. It's not. It's about knowing what's admissible, what's documentable, and what sequence of moves forecloses your opponent's options before they realize the game has started. I'd been doing it for 15 years. I was good at it. Vivian had been sleeping next to a corporate litigator for 9 years and had apparently decided I was the kind of man who would cry into a pillow and ask her to explain herself. She was about to learn otherwise. Maisie came downstairs at 6:15 in her socks, the ones with the small foxes on them, dragging her stuffed rabbit by one ear. She padded into the kitchen and stopped when she saw me at the table. "Daddy, you didn't sleep." "I'm okay, baby. You hungry?" She nodded, climbed into her chair, and watched me move to the refrigerator. Then she said, "I drew a picture," and held it out. A folded piece of printer paper, the cheap kind from the office tray, crayon wax leaving blue residue on her fingers. I unfolded it. Stick figures. 2 adults, 1 small. A rectangle with tall lines for walls. Floor-to-ceiling windows, the way a child draws a building that's mostly glass. A body of water suggested by a blue horizontal line. The taller adult figure had yellow hair. The other had a black rectangle in its hand, which I understood after a moment to be a phone. Maisie had written at the top, in the careful block letters of a first grader, "Mommy and Mr. Preston at the glass house on the Lac." The smell of blue crayon wax, cheap printer paper, the weight of a child's evidence. I stood at the refrigerator with the drawing in my hand and I did not move for several seconds. "Is that good, Daddy?" I folded it along its original crease. "Yeah, baby, that's real good." I photographed it with my phone before I set it down. Dated the file, named it Maisie, Evidence, 001. Then I walked to my car in my bare feet, opened the sun visor, and taped the original to the inside of it. Every time I pulled down that visor in the weeks that followed, there were stick figures and blue wax and a 6-year-old's spelling of a CEO's name. It kept me calibrated. I called your sister at 7:30 a.m. Renata picks up for me. Always has. She likes me more than she's ever admitted to you, Vivian, because I'm reliable and I don't perform. I told her I was worried about you, that you seemed stressed, that I'd noticed some distance, and I was trying to understand if something was going on at work. Renata has your instinct for the performance, but not your discipline for it. She started talking before she decided what to say, which meant she was saying the true thing while her brain was still searching for the useful thing. I let her talk. She said you'd been under pressure. She said the Calder-Vance restructuring was brutal. She said Preston Calder was demanding and didn't respect work-life boundaries, and she was sure that's all it was, that the late nights were just the culture there. I let her keep going. "Renata," I said, "how long have you known?" Silence. The specific silence of someone who has just heard the question they were hoping wouldn't be asked. "Declan, I swear it wasn't supposed to go this far." I had already set my phone to record before she finished the sentence. "How long?" 8 months. The air in the kitchen changed quality. I noticed it the way you notice a pressure shift before weather. "You introduced them," I said. "It was a networking event. It wasn't supposed to be anything. It was just a dinner," and I thought, "Renata, I appreciate you telling me." I ended the call. I sat with the recording for a moment. Then I opened a browser and searched Preston Calder, CEO, 47. Married to Celeste Calder, philanthropist, board member, Lake Harrow Preservation Trust. Photo of them at a charity gala. She was tall, dark-haired, composed in the specific way of women who have learned that composure is the most efficient form of power. The Glass Lodge at Lake Harrow was registered to a Calder-Vance subsidiary. Property records showed it had been purchased 3 years ago for $4.2 million. I wrote Celeste on the legal pad and circled it twice. Then I pulled Preston's executive compensation structure from the Calder-Vance proxy filing. Proxy filings are public record. Section 14C, Conduct Provisions. Unvested stock, $11.3 million, tied to a morals clause with language broad enough to drive a truck through. I read it twice. Then I made coffee. So, here's what I had before 8 a.m. on a Tuesday. A 6-year-old's crayon drawing, a recorded confession from your sister, a morals clause worth $11 million, SEC filing anomalies, and the name of a woman who didn't know her husband had been timing his visits to a lake house around her charity calendar. You were asleep 20 feet away, dreaming whatever people dream when they think they've gotten away with it. I finished my coffee. I didn't wake you. I let you have the dream. You wouldn't have much else. I found Dex Quint through my paralegal Tess, who has been with me for 6 years and knows more about the city's private investigative ecosystem than anyone I've met in a courtroom. She described him in 2 sentences. He's boring and he's never wrong. That was enough. We met in his Silverado in the library parking lot 2 days later. The truck smelled like cedar and old cigarettes. Not the fresh kind, but the kind that lives in the upholstery. That's been there so long it's become part of the fabric's molecular structure. Quint was 54, built like a man who'd stopped caring about looking like anything in particular, with a notebook on the dashboard and a thermos of coffee that he didn't offer to share. You already had photos before I called you, I said. He pulled a folder from behind the seat. Insurance work. I was watching the property for a lien dispute on the subsidiary that owns it. Your wife walked into frame on day 3. He set the folder on the console between us. Seemed relevant to keep going. I opened it. GPS tagged, time-stamped, admissible. 17 photographs of Preston Calder's glass lodge taken from the public trail easement over 6 weeks. In 4 of them, Vivian's car was visible in the lot. In 2, there were figures in the lit interior, visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows that Preston had apparently never considered a liability. What do you charge? Flat fee, $8,000. I don't do hourly. Too much incentive to be slow? I wrote him a check on the spot. He took it without looking at the amount. There's something else you should know. Preston's wife, Celeste, she does preservation trust work at the lake, fundraisers. She's there on weekends sometimes. He times the visits around her calendar. He tapped the folder. I've been cross-referencing. Every visit in here is a weekday, never a weekend. I wrote Celeste, timing, calendar, on the pad in my lap. He's careful, I said. He was careful, Quint said. Past tense? Right. You came home 2 evenings later with dinner from the Italian place I used to like. The one we went to on our first anniversary. You set it on the table with the careful choreography of a woman who has decided that a good meal and a soft voice constitute a reset button. You'd changed out of your work clothes into the blue wrap dress. You poured wine. I sat down. I asked about your week. You described it. A project timeline, a difficult client, a meeting that ran long. I already knew the timestamps. I knew which evenings you'd been at the lodge, and which evenings you'd been genuinely late at the office because Quint had documented both, and I'd cross-referenced your calendar. Everything you said was technically true except the architecture it was built on. I feel like we've been distant, you said. You refilled your wine while saying it, didn't look up. We have been. I want to fix that. I know you do. You looked up then, searching for something in my face. Reassurance, maybe, or the specific softness that means you've been forgiven without the conversation happening. I gave you nothing readable. Just ate the pasta. Declan. It's good, the pasta. You set your fork down. I need you to talk to me. I'm talking to you. You know what I mean? I don't think I do. You picked your fork back up. Ate 3 bites in silence. Then you threw the dish towel at the counter. Not at me, just at the counter. The specific violence of a woman who wants to throw something but knows throwing something at a person is a different category of event. You went upstairs. I cleared the table. I put the leftovers in the refrigerator. I went back to the laptop. Here's the thing about that dinner. I wasn't performing. I wasn't being strategic about my affect. I was genuinely, completely calm in the way that happens when you're past the part where you feel things and into the part where you just do the next correct thing. The grief had come and gone in the kitchen at 2 a.m. What I had now was something colder and more functional. I built caldervancetruth.com on a Thursday night. Anonymous hosting offshore registrar. It took 4 hours. I populated it with Quint's photographs, GPS coordinates in the metadata, timestamps embedded, each image captioned with date, time, and distance from the trail easement to confirm public access. I uploaded a transcript of Renata's recorded call with names and identifying details of uninvolved parties redacted. I added Maisie's drawing with the faces blurred, just the glass house, just the lake, just the handwritten label at the top. I included the SEC filing anomalies with a plain language explanation that a financial journalist would understand in 30 seconds, and Section 14C of the Calder-Vance proxy filing. The morals clause, highlighted. I set a 72-hour auto-publish timer. Then I drafted one email to Preston Calder's personal address, the one that appeared in a 3-year-old conference program I found in a Google cache. One line, Section 14C, says hello. I sent it at 11:47 p.m. Then I sat back in the chair and looked at what I'd built. It was, I thought, a reasonably elegant piece of architecture. Not a weapon exactly, a structure. A thing that would stand on its own once the timer ran out, regardless of what anyone did between now and then. Quint was riding shotgun the next afternoon when I reviewed the photographs again in his truck. He mentioned his daughter, offhand, the way he mentions most things, without apparent investment in whether you're listening. She used this app after her divorce. Values-based matching, singletune.com. You answer 100 questions about what you actually believe before you see anyone's face. She said it was the first time she talked to someone who already knew what mattered to her. I was looking at a photograph of the lodge's west elevation. Just saying, not everyone ends up alone. I know. I wasn't thinking about not being alone. I was thinking about the angle of the camera relative to the public easement and whether a defense attorney could argue the photographs were taken from private property. They couldn't. But I was thinking about it anyway, because that's the kind of thing I think about. The name singletune.com landed somewhere in the back of my mind and stayed there. I didn't examine it. I had other things to do. Preston moved wrong. He got my email, and instead of calling a lawyer, which is what a man with $11 million at stake should do when he receives a legal threat, he called you. I know this because you called me screaming from a number I didn't recognize, which meant you'd borrowed someone's phone after I'd blocked yours. What did you do? What the hell did you do, Declan? I didn't answer. Preston then called my firm, asked the receptionist to identify the attorney who sent a personal email to Mr. Calder. My assistant, Tess, logged the call with timestamps. I added it to the folder. Documented contact, attempted suppression. The man had $11 million in a morals clause and a 72-hour countdown, and his response was to make phone calls that I would later be able to characterize as intimidation attempts. I almost felt something like pity. Almost. I was driving back from the trail easement at dusk on day 7 when the Range Rover appeared behind me on Route 9. Preston's plate, I confirmed it later. He must have followed me from somewhere, or had me followed, or just gotten lucky with the timing. Route 9 runs through the hills east of town, switchbacks and no guardrails on the drop side. The kind of road that's fine if you're paying attention and dangerous if someone wants it to be. He was on my bumper by the first curve, headlights filling the rearview mirror. I kept my speed even, both hands on the wheel, and watched him in the mirror the way you watch something that hasn't decided yet what it's going to do. By the second curve, he was close enough that I could see the shape of him through the windshield. Hands high on the wheel, jaw set. At the hairpin, he accelerated. He came around me fast on the inside of the curve, on a road with no shoulder, on a blind corner, in a $90,000 truck with the specific confidence of a man who has never experienced a consequence that money couldn't reroute. He cut back in front of me hard. I braked hard. The rear tires lost traction on the gravel shoulder, and I felt the front bumper touch the guardrail. One solid tap, metal on metal, and then I was stopped with the engine running and the Range Rover's taillights disappearing around the next bend. 30 seconds of engine noise, and my own breathing. My hands were steady when I picked up the phone. Quint, I need a photo of Preston Calder's Range Rover. Full plate documentation. Tonight, if possible. What happened? He tried to use a mountain road as a message. Pause. I'll have it by morning. I sat on the shoulder for another minute. The guardrail had a fresh scrape on it that hadn't been there before. I photographed it with my phone, dated the file, added it to the folder. Here's the part I want you to understand, Vivian. The letter I drafted to Celeste Calder, I wrote it that same night. No return address, no accusation, no commentary. 3 of Quint's clearest photographs, a photocopy of Section 14C with the relevant language underlined in red. That's all. I sealed it myself. I mailed it from a post office 2 towns over on a Tuesday morning. Same errand as dropping Maisie at school. I kissed Maisie on the top of her head in the drop-off line, watched her run toward the building in her fox socks, and then drove to the post office and dropped a padded envelope into the slot. It was the most ordinary morning I'd had in 2 weeks. The letter was in the mail. The website had 61 hours on its timer. Preston Calder had tried to run me off a mountain road, and I'd written it down instead of calling the police, because a police report is public record, and I wasn't done building yet. You left me a 7th voicemail. I hadn't listened to any of them. I already knew what you said. Garrison Pruitt lives next door. Has for 11 years. He's 67, retired fire marshal, the kind of man who watches things not because he's nosy, but because watching things is a professional habit that doesn't turn off just because you've stopped getting paid for it. He sits on his porch in the mornings with coffee and a spiral notebook, and he writes things down: weather, vehicles, patterns. I knocked on his door at 8 a.m. on a Monday. He was already on the porch. Figured you'd come around eventually, he said. He set his coffee down and picked up the spiral notebook without being asked. Black Range Rover, 14 visits, I got dates, times, plate. He held it out. I was going to say something. I didn't think it was my place. It's your place now. He looked at me for a moment. How long you known? Long enough to be ready. We were at a notary by 9 a.m. Sworn affidavit, signed and stamped, before most people had finished their second cup of coffee. Garrison's handwriting is precise and unhurried, the handwriting of a man who knows that documentation is the only thing that survives a fire. I added it to the folder. So, here's what I had at the start of week 2. Quint's photographs, Garrison's affidavit, Renata's recorded call, Maisie's drawing, the SEC anomalies, the morals clause, a documented intimidation attempt on Route 9, and a letter in the mail to a woman named Celeste, who did preservation work at the lake and didn't know her husband had been timing his visits around her charity calendar. The website had 38 hours on its timer. I was picking up Maisie from a birthday party at a downtown restaurant on Wednesday afternoon. The kind of place with exposed brick and a prix-fixe menu, and the specific lighting that makes everyone look like they're about to say something significant. Maisie had cake on her collar. She was holding a balloon. Preston walked in with 2 Calder Vance board members. He saw me from across the room. I watched him make the calculation. Saw the moment he decided that the correct move was to cross the floor and establish dominance in a public space in front of witnesses. He put his hand on my shoulder. We should talk, he said. I looked at his hand on my shoulder. Then I removed it. One finger at a time, the way you remove something you don't want to touch any more than necessary. I don't think we should, I said. You need to understand what you're doing here. I understand exactly what I'm doing. His jaw tightened. He was 6 inches taller than me and had the specific physical confidence of a man who has used his size as punctuation in enough rooms to believe it always works. He shoved me, both hands, center of the chest, not hard enough to knock me down, but hard enough to be unambiguous. I stepped aside, let the momentum carry him. He stumbled forward into a table set for 4, glasses, a candle, a breadbasket, and the whole thing went over with a sound like a small catastrophe. The room went silent. 2 people had their phones out before the last glass stopped rolling. I crouched down to Maisie's level. She was holding her balloon with both hands, eyes wide. Get your coat, baby. Daddy, it's okay. Get your coat. I stood up. Preston was standing in broken glass. Board members on either side of him. The entire restaurant watching. His collar was up. He had a habit of touching it when things weren't going the way he'd planned. I'd noticed that from his conference appearances online. He was touching it now. You think you're clever, he said. I think you just assaulted me in front of 40 people and a 6-year-old. Maisie had her coat. I took her hand. We walked out. I called Quint from the sidewalk. I need the restaurant's name logged with a timestamp. Preston Calder made physical contact in front of witnesses. 2 people photographed it. You okay? Yeah. Maisie looked up at me. Mr. Preston knocked over the table. He did. That was bad manners. It was. I filed for divorce and primary custody that Friday. 3:47 p.m., 13 minutes before the courthouse closes. The fluorescent lights in the corridor hummed at a frequency that gets into your teeth. I'd been here 100 times as an attorney and never once as a petitioner. The clerk took the filing without comment, stamped it, handed me the receipt, Quint's evidence, Garrison's affidavit, Renata's recorded call, all attached as exhibits. Vivian's attorney wouldn't see it until Monday. I had the weekend. I drove out of the courthouse parking lot and sat for a moment with the engine running. The fluorescent hum was gone, replaced by traffic and the specific quiet of a car that's waiting to go somewhere. An ad surfaced on my phone screen while I was sitting there. Singletune.com, values first. The tagline, know what they believe before you know what they look like. I sat with it for a moment. 14 months of a woman who had shared my bed and had a completely different set of values the entire time. Not different politics or different taste in movies, different fundamental values. About honesty, about what a family was for, about what you owed the person who trusted you. The idea of someone who already knew what mattered to you before they knew your face. I understood now why that would be the opposite of everything we'd been. I put the phone down, I drove home. You arrived Sunday night. I'd left a copy of the divorce filing on the kitchen table. I wasn't trying to be cruel about it. I just didn't see a reason to hide it. You came in at 9 p.m. and found it. I heard the sound of pages turning, then a silence, then something ceramic hitting the wall in the hallway. Not thrown at me, just thrown. The violence of a woman who had expected to have more time. Maisie was at my sister's house. You came into the kitchen and you screamed for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the microwave. You said I had gone behind your back, that I had violated your privacy, that you had done nothing wrong, that this was about my ego and my inability to handle a successful woman, that I was destroying our family, that Maisie would never forgive me. I sat at the table with my hands flat on the surface, and I let you run through it. When you finally stopped, I said, you had 8 months to say a word to me. This is about Preston, and you know it's not what you think. 41 hotel receipts, 14 months. I've been counting since March. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. You went very still. I watched you recalculate, watched the performance dissolve into something that was almost real. The specific expression of a person who has just understood that the other person already knew, has known for a long time, and has been waiting. You've been counting, you said, since March. You sat down. First time you'd sat in 11 minutes. Your hands were shaking, I noticed that. Not with rage, with something else. I got up, rinsed my glass, and went to bed. The next morning, I was in my office when Preston's lawyer called. Demanded the website be taken down. Claimed defamation, harassment, tortious interference with business relations. The lawyer's voice had the specific confidence of a man who charges $800 an hour and expects that number to do its own persuasion. I dictated my response to Tess in 30 seconds. The photographs are licensed from a private investigator operating on a public easement. The transcript is an accurate record of a recorded call. The SEC filings are public documents. The morals clause is a public proxy filing. Tell your client I look forward to his deposition. The lawyer didn't call back. That evening, I came home late to find Preston's Range Rover in my driveway. He was on the porch, not armed, no weapon, nothing like that. Just standing there in the specific posture of a man who has decided that physical presence is still a card he can play. 6'2", hands at his sides, blocking the door. I stopped on the walkway. We stood in the dark. The porch light was on and it caught the side of his face, the jaw, the collar he was already touching. You need to pull that sight down, he said. I need to get inside. You're on my property. I will make this very expensive for you. You already did, you just didn't know it yet. He didn't move. I took my phone out, opened the camera, and photographed him standing on my porch. Timestamp, location data. He looked at the phone, then he walked to his car, got in, left. I stood on the walkway for a moment after the taillights disappeared. The night was cold and quiet. I thought about the journalist. I had a financial reporter's number on my phone, a woman who covered capital markets and had broken two SEC enforcement stories in the last year. I had Preston's filing anomalies. One call, and his career became a news cycle before the divorce was even finalized. I sat with the phone in my hand for 11 minutes. Then I put it face down on the porch railing. That's not justice, I thought. That's appetite. I know the difference. Barely right now, but I know it. The website had everything it needed. The morals clause had everything it needed. Celeste had the letter. The board would have what it needed when they needed it. That was the structure. That was the architecture. Adding a news cycle on top of it wasn't justice. It was me wanting to watch something burn. And wanting to watch it burn is a different thing from needing it to burn. I went inside. Quint and I were going through the final evidence package in his Silverado the following morning. Cedar and cigarette residue, thermos coffee. The folder spread across the console between us. He mentioned his daughter again. She actually met someone on that app, Singletune. They spent the first 2 weeks just talking. What they'd been through and what they believed. No photos until week 3. She said it was the first time she didn't feel like she was auditioning. I looked up from the folder. The first time she didn't feel like she was auditioning, I said. That's what she said. I thought about 9 years of marriage and the specific performance quality of the last 14 months of it. The dinners, the soft voice, the blue wrap dress, the Italian restaurant that was supposed to be a reset button. The whole architecture of the lie requiring constant maintenance, constant performance, constant auditioning. The idea of someone who already knows what you believe before they know what you look like. Someone you don't have to perform for because the performance has already been stripped away by the questions. I understood it now in a way I hadn't when Quint first mentioned it. Not as a thing I needed, just as a thing that made sense. A thing that named something. I put it away. There was still work to do. You called me that afternoon with an ultimatum. I let you finish. You wanted me to drop the custody filing, pull the website, agree to a clean split with no contested assets. In return, you'd cooperate. No counterfiling, no character witnesses, no dragging it out. I've thought about it, I said. And? I realized you're not a serious person, Viv. Excuse me, not an insult, a verdict. You don't get to set terms on a game you already lost. You hung up. I went back to the custody brief. Renata showed up at my office 2 days later. Uninvited, unannounced, pushing past the front desk with the specific energy of a woman who has decided that the rules of professional spaces don't apply to her emotional emergency. Tess was in my office reviewing exhibits when Renata came through the door. You ruined my sister's life, she said. She was across the desk before I could stand, grabbing my arm. Renata, you introduced them. You covered for them. You recorded yourself saying so. You had no right to use that. She shoved the exhibit stack off the desk. Papers everywhere. She got in my face, close enough that I could see she'd been crying for a long time, that her mascara had tracked and dried and tracked again, that this was not a performance but an actual collapse. I stepped back, nodded to Tess. Tess was already dialing building security. Renata swung at me, open palm, aimed at my face, missed by 4 inches when I moved. Security had her out the door in 90 seconds. She was still talking when the elevator doors closed. Tess filed an incident report. I added it to the folder. I sat at my desk for a moment after the room was quiet again. The exhibit stack was on the floor. I picked up the pages one by one and put them back in order. Here's what I want to tell you about Renata, Vivian. I don't hate her. She's not a serious person either. She introduced you to Preston because she thought it would be good for your career, and she kept the secret because she didn't know how to stop keeping it once she'd started. That's not malice. That's just a person who made a series of small choices that added up to something large and then couldn't find the exit. I don't hate you either. I want you to understand that. What I did wasn't hate. It was accounting. Howard Voss is a quiet man. Retired contractor, 63, The kind of man who built things with his hands for 40 years and developed a specific respect for structural integrity as a result. He doesn't talk much at Sunday dinner. He passes things, he refills glasses, he listens. Your mother told me later that he'd been listening to the recorded call on his phone for 3 days before Sunday dinner, that he'd played it to himself in the garage, alone, with the door closed, trying to understand what he was hearing, trying to reconcile the voice on the recording, Renata's voice, his daughter's voice, saying, 8 months, it wasn't supposed to go this far, with the family he thought he had. He played it at Sunday dinner. I wasn't there. I heard about it from your mother, Elaine, who called me the following Monday morning and asked if she could come by. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd sat at 2 a.m. with a yellow legal pad. And she said, "I'm sorry, Declan. I'm sorry for what she did, and I'm sorry I didn't see it. You couldn't have known. I should have asked better questions." She had Maisie's school photo in her hand, the one from last fall, the one where Maisie is wearing the yellow cardigan and grinning with the gap where her front tooth was. Elaine had brought it herself, taken it from the frame in your parents' living room. "Can I still see her?" Elaine asked. Maisie. "Of course. She loves you. That doesn't change." Elaine nodded. She set the photo on the table between us. Howard didn't say anything after he played it. He just turned the phone off and went back to eating. Vivienne left the table. Renata started crying, and Howard just ate his dinner. I understood Howard Voss in that moment in a way I hadn't before. The quiet man who builds things and respects structural integrity, who had listened to the recording for 3 days in his garage and then waited for the right moment to let the structure speak for itself. "He built things his whole life," I said. "He did. He knows what happens when the foundation's wrong." Elaine looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Take care of Maisie." "That's the whole plan," I said. The Caldervance board received Celeste's forwarded letter the same week. She hadn't called Preston, hadn't confronted him, hadn't cried, as far as anyone could tell. She had taken the envelope I'd mailed, the photographs, the Section 14C photocopy, and forwarded the entire thing to the audit committee with one line. "This requires your attention." That was all. 7 words. An emergency session was called. Preston's $11.3 million in unvested stock was frozen pending conduct review. His company car was recalled the same afternoon, a detail I found out from Quint, who had a contact on the building's security staff and heard that Preston had stood in the Calder-Vance parking structure for 20 minutes after the recall notice appeared on his windshield, just standing there with his keys in his hand, not moving. You lost your position the same week. The board couldn't retain a direct report named in the conduct inquiry. HR called you at 4 p.m. on a Wednesday. You called me. I let it go to voicemail. I played it twice. The second time, I noticed you never said you were sorry. You said you'd lost everything and it was my fault. You said I had been methodical and cold and that you didn't recognize me anymore. I deleted it and called Maisie's school to confirm pickup the next morning. The mediator's office was downtown, 3rd floor, beige carpet and a rectangular table, and the specific quality of light that comes from windows that face a parking structure. Flat, directionless, the kind of light that makes everything look like a document. We sat on opposite sides of the table. You had your attorney, I had mine. The mediator was a woman named Aldridge, who had been doing this for 20 years, and had the specific affect of a person who has heard every version of every story, and is no longer surprised by any of them. You were wearing the gray suit, the one you wore for important meetings. Your hair was pulled back. You looked like someone preparing to negotiate, which is what you were doing because that's the only register you had left. I had the folder. Aldridge walked us through the asset schedule, the house, the accounts, the retirement funds. You had a number in mind. I could see it in the way you sat, the specific stillness of a person who has rehearsed their position. Then Aldridge got to the custody schedule. Mr. Mace is requesting primary physical custody with standard visitation for Ms. Mace, Aldridge said. He has filed supporting documentation including investigative photographs, a sworn neighbor affidavit, a recorded call, and a child's drawing dated. The drawing is irrelevant, your attorney said. The drawing establishes the child's awareness of the extramarital relationship, my attorney said. The child drew the affair partner's property from memory and identified it by name. You looked at the table. Maisie drew it herself, I said. She gave it to me at 6:15 in the morning. She thought it was a good picture. You didn't look up. The negotiation took 4 hours. At the end of it, I had primary physical custody, the house, and a settlement structure that your attorney had spent 2 hours trying to improve and couldn't. You had visitation, a fraction of the joint accounts, and the knowledge that every piece of documentation in the folder was now part of a court record. I signed my copies at 4:47 p.m. The fluorescent hum in the corridor was the same as it had been the day I filed. That same frequency, that same quality of institutional light that doesn't care what it's illuminating. I took the elevator down, pushed through the lobby door into the afternoon. The light outside was different. Actual daylight, low and angled, the kind that comes in late afternoon and early fall when the season is changing and the air has that specific quality of something ending and something else not yet named. I sat in my car for a few minutes, not thinking about anything in particular, just sitting. The cedar smell from Quint's truck wasn't there, but I remembered it. The cold tile at 2 a.m., the blue crayon wax on Maisie's fingers, the courthouse corridor hum, the photograph of Preston on my porch, timestamp in the corner, location data in the metadata. The structure had held. I pulled the sun visor down. Maisie's drawing was still there, taped to the inside, the blue wax slightly faded now, the printer paper soft at the folds. Stick figures and floor-to-ceiling windows, and a body of water and the careful block letters of a first grader who had drawn what she'd seen, because drawing what you see is what you do when you're 6, and the world is full of things worth recording. Mommy and Mr. Preston at the Glass House on the Lac. Yeah, baby, I said to the empty car. That was real good. I folded the visor back up. I started the engine. I pulled out of the courthouse parking lot. The road home ran north through town and then up into the hills, past the Route 9 switchbacks where Preston had tried to use a mountain road as a message, past the trail easement where Quint had stood with a camera and documented everything, past the turnoff to Lake Harrow, where a glass lodge with floor-to-ceiling windows sat empty now, its owner standing in a parking structure, somewhere with a recall notice and $11 million he couldn't touch. I drove past all of it. At the top of the hill, before the road curved back down toward home, I could see the lake in the distance, a flat gray line between the trees, ordinary and still. I didn't stop. I kept driving. Maisie would be home from school in 40 minutes. I had exactly enough time.